It's the question on everyone's minds when we start comparing science fiction and fantasy. What would happen in a world where magic and modernization finally clash, when technology and the spells and fantasy that we all hold dear come to blows? Today on Desks and Dorks, we're talking magic versus modernization. But a couple things before we get started. If you would like to support any of the work that we do here, you can of course back us over on Patreon. $10 a month gets you your own unique role-playing game you can't get anywhere else, and once you get it for the month, it's gone for good. You can pick up any of the physical games that we have made over at Tabletop Bookshelf or from our partners over at Indie Press Revolution. And last but certainly not least, if you love what we do and you want a digital copy, why not pick it up from itch.io. But now let's talk about some ground rules. We're going to posit how magic and technology might intersect and how that might change things in a fantasy world. I was trained as a medievalist, for those not in the know, and I love using how history talks about things and how history changes, develops things when I'm using my own role-playing games. And we don't necessarily have real magic in the real world. So this is going to be really interesting, at least from my terms as a sort of speculative scholar. And I think when we're talking about magic versus modernity, we need to define what we're going to consider as the kind of modern developments for this, because obviously we don't have somebody running around New York City shooting lightning bolts out of their eyes. If we do, that would be amazing, but we don't have it. And so for us, we need to consider how or where we're getting our inspiration from. And for me, I'm going to be treating the arrival of magic in a fantasy world kind of like the arrival of significant changes to human development, whether that's technological development, economic development, cultural development. Basically, if it's going to shift a civilization massively, I think that's a good springboard for us to have a discussion about what magic and technology intersecting might look like. And here's the thing, in order for us to talk about that, let me give you some examples. As impactful as it is, and I have done full videos on both the Bronze and Iron Ages, I don't think the Bronze Age shift into the Iron Age is a good example of what magic would look like. Yes, Bronze did cause a massive shift in human civilization, it did cause a massive change in development, but human civilization, warfare, economics, and culture were still mostly recognizable or very similar pre-Bronze Age and post-Bronze Age. It took centuries for that technology to sort of cause the massive root or cause the massive change that we're talking about here. When I'm discussing things like a magical shift, I think things like the Industrial Age are a far greater example of this, right? Industrialization arises with the use of coal and steam and the factory system, and basically overhauls things not necessarily overnight, but in the span of something like 25 to 50 years, as opposed to the span of 500 to 1,000 years. Similarly, I think modern warfare, like for example, the shift from pre-World War I to World War I styles of conflict is a great example. We could even go back as far as the Napoleonic or the Civil War to really talk about how the rise of modern warfare, quote unquote, began. I think that is another great shift that could be a wonderful stand-in for how magic might impact a world. Or if you really want to get even further back, the creation of human agriculture or nuclear power, if you want to get away from the warfare or the economics examples, both of those, I think, serve as massive epochs in human change that would work similarly to the rise of magic. And of course, you could talk about things like the rise of vaccines or how the creation of penicillin, any of that stuff would also apply. But first we have to talk about one more thing, and that's our fictional kingdom. If you're a fan of Desks and Dorks videos, you'll know that I like to create something with you, the viewer, the commenter, everybody here. We work on something at the start of a video and it sculpts until the end. We've done this for religions, for organizations, for armies and diseases, and today we're going to do it with a fantasy kingdom. But I am a little bit inspired by the episode Remedial Chaos Theory from my favorite show, Community. We're not just going to give you one big example that we sculpt over time. What we're going to do is we're going to give you one fantasy kingdom and how it might interact and react to major events in its history in the same way that a conflict between magic and technology might work. And so what you're going to get is the same kingdom, 4 different ways, 4 different alternate branching realities. And for us to establish that, we have to talk about the Kingdom of Alessian. I made Alessian to be as stock standard fantasy as possible. It is modeled off of Western medieval Europe. It includes, of course, all of the hallmarks of the later feudal period, things like a dynastic monarchy. This is our boy, King Monarch I. Of course, it's a dynastic monarchy, passed from father to son, daughter to daughter, daughter to son, whatever. We, of course, have a group, rank and file knights who maintain and manage these fiefs. They are land-owning knights, which means that they are, in addition to being responsible for helping to man the king's armies and maintain military service, they're also there as both bureaucrats and land managers and landowners in the same way that regular knights in the feudal period would be. They hold land. That's the important thing. And because I wanted to make this as bog standard as humanly possible, I even threw in an adventurers guild for you sick people out there. Even though it is totally ahistorical, I put in guilds that help to manage and control key industries. This is as bog standard a Western fantasy as possible. I can literally hear the Final Fantasy dun, 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 music right now. Like, literally, this place sounds turn-based. But there's a problem. During one of the king's reigns, or the reign of King Monarch III, we'll say, a mysterious gemstone falls from the sky. This gemstone is able to be harnessed by the rank and file of this world, those without any magical abilities, and with it, they can craft amazing wonders in industry and in weaponry. It is from this incredible transformation, this incredible substance, that a new revolution is sparked, one that is fueled by this place and by this resource, which we are going to call Magistone. And we'll see exactly how Magistone impacts our friends, the technology they develop, and the societies that they create. And this is the interesting part. I studied a lot of different civilizations, not even just Western ones, and how they reacted to major shifts. And I have ranked these from most common historically to least common. And part 1 is partial destruction. This is what happens when a culture or a kingdom, a society, a religion, or a nation state is exposed to something so vast and so powerful that they are forced to adapt almost immediately. But as with most things, they're not able to adapt completely. In this model, part of the culture, not all of the culture, but part of the culture is absorbed, destroyed, or assimilated in the wake or in response to the development as it stands. This creates something entirely brand new, and a great example of this actually comes from the Neolithic period, the way that human beings changed and developed as a response to agriculture. And the reason I say this is a partial destruction is because hunting and gathering ways didn't completely go by the wayside as a response to the development of agriculture, to breeding plants, to making farming methods. In fact, many of the useful skills, trades, and tricks of the hunting and gathering lifestyle stayed and were actually turned into forms of defense, or in some cases, forms of conquest for the tribe. And they did still exist as ways to get food. Now, over time, those wonderful skills, despite the fact that they might be used to grab, useful, resources like ivory, over time, however, those skills evolved or were eventually changed out, especially as human beings created larger settlements, larger civilizations. Villages turned into towns, which turned into cities. And once you're in a city, those skills of hunting and gathering become less valuable than things like brewing or things like writing. It's a gradual evolution as a result of losing or having one part of that culture, one part of that civilization be completely and totally superseded. This is the most common thing that happens historically, as it's far more likely that one part of a culture will be deemed irrelevant or be unable to compete or adapt with a new development, as opposed to the entire culture itself. If you want a really great physical or fantasy example of this, I would highly encourage you to check out the television show Arcane and how Piltover and Zon, the fictional civilizations that are present within that show, develop in response to the introduction of hex tech. And this takes us back to the Kingdom of Alessian. The Magistone sails through the sky, crashing through the upper reaches of the planet and landing smack dab onto Alessian's borders. Now, the merchants are the first people to find the Magistone, and at first they mistake it for just another precious gemstone, attempting to trade it as follows. But over time they realize that this is an incredible tool, and they begin to develop tools with the Magistone. These tools allow them to up their productivity and increase the strength and efficacy of their craft, especially in the area of iron refining. Over time, these guilds are able to shape the Magistone tools into weapons, and with those weapons are finally able to take back some of their rights from the individuals that they have been clashing with. Now, the knights do not take too kindly to this, as the merchants, in between both the knights who rule over the feudal states of the Kingdom of Alessian and the serfs themselves, the knights don't exactly take, too kindly to the idea that they're getting uppity, and as a result, they rally, they attack, and a battle between the merchants and the knights breaks out in full, and the knights get absolutely dumpstered, unable to keep up with this new technology, with projectiles that pierce their plate, with weapons that they can barely begin to comprehend. The knights are unable to manage to mount much of a significant offense or defense, and as a result, the king decides to step in. He brings the merchants to the negotiating table. He realizes without the support of his aristocratic soldiers, the knights, he's unable to really affect the situation militarily, but politically, he gives up part of his power and establishes a bicameral sort of leadership. The king still retains a lot of his authority. The merchants at this point don't think or aren't ready to go into full-blown political revolution, and the king knows this. So by sacrificing a little bit of his power now, he's able to assuage their fears of self-representation in the future. And what you have is a mix between a traditional monarchy and a plutocracy where the merchants hold sway. Now, this brings me to my next thing, which is, again, we established that once a partial destruction takes place, a gradual change, a gradual cultural shift is bound to happen. And this is true in Alessian as well. Over time, that plutocracy and that monarchy give way to what is literally a parliamentary form of democracy, with the king as sort of a nominal figurehead, and with the people, whether they are wealthy, like in the case of the merchants, or the serfs who manned the merchants' weapons, getting representation in parliament. And by the way, we saw partial destruction like that too when gunpowder was introduced to Western Europe. And that brings me to part 2, the complete overhaul. Unlike a partial destruction of one element of a culture, I think that when magic and technology might meet, it would result in the total and complete overhaul of a culture or a kingdom, of a group. Now, sometimes this looks like total and complete destruction, the rubble and ruin of everything that has come before it, but it could be more than just simple destruction. It can also, for example, be assimilation. This would occur when the conquered group, or when the group that is in the middle of this massive change, decides to adopt the rituals or the important trappings of the development, the advancement, or the conquering group that is, taking over their place. Assimilation, unfortunately, happens in many ways. A really unfortunate and perhaps grim example of this is the way that the Native Americans were treated both here in the United States, and that Native people were treated in places like Canada through the form of residential schools. That's a unfortunately grim but excellent example of what that kind of assimilation might look like in the face of an overwhelming or culturally changing force, in the same way that the Western invasion of native lands would have been. But a great example of this, perhaps for better or for worse, is the westernization and industrialization of Japan. You see, one of the things that I think is really important is the Meiji Restoration. If you want to talk about world history, there is perhaps no other or few other great industrial developments like the Meiji Restoration. In a period of literally about 50 years, Japan goes from being a relatively non-westernized, non-industrialized nation into being one of the most militarily advanced, militarily aggressive, industrially competent, and internationally connected countries on the planet. It is this level of industrialization and the complete overhaul of its educational and cultural systems that allowed it to advance to a point on the world stage. Now, on the positive side of things, this did, over time, allow Japan to essentially become the makers of their own destiny, the writers of their own future in that pre-World War I and into World War I era. However, on the bad side, it basically paved the way for one of the most dark and imperialist points in Japan's history, leading into their involvement with the Axis powers in World War II. But again, it's that kind of thing that is a total cultural shift. And it's this instant evolution that is followed by the foundation for the next step. You see, in a complete and total overhaul situation, historically speaking, that country, that kingdom, that nation state isn't going to stay in that evolved state for long. They will either regress or they will become something completely different. In Japan's case, that massive dark stain of imperialism that followed Japan into World War II winds up paving the way for its industrialization in a new way. Because they were depleted with resources after World War II, and because they were forced to give up a lot of their military and industrial might, Japan was forced to actually sort of pivot. As a result, they pivoted into information technologies and entertainment, creating the Japan of the 1980s that was a driving force in programming, computing, robotics, automotives, and of course entertainment with things like anime and manga. And that of course brings us back to the Kingdom of Alessian. As before, the Magistone comet sails through the atmosphere, crashes into Alessian's borders, and has an immediate impact on every aspect of Alessian life. Instead of just the merchants, the king, the knights, the merchants, and the serfs all recognize and grab on to Magistone as an important resource and try to harness it immediately. It has incredible knock-on effects on every part of Alessian life. The king and the knights create massive Magistone fortifications, while the merchants and the peasantry use Magistone to create moving dwellings or villages and towns protected by Magistone circuitry, which allows them to survive actual upfront attacks. Transportation is overhauled almost immediately as the serfs and merchants begin to create wheelless carts to help transport goods to and from different cities and different towns, while the king and the knights create airborne Magistone constructs, allowing them to survey the lands that they quote-unquote control. And as these technologies begin to diverge, war immediately breaks out, with Magistone automatons and fully powered Magistone armor taking the brunt of the new conflict. This creates not just a series of scuffles and political issues, it paves the way for a arms race in defense and fortification, as castles, fortresses, towns, and entire complexes shielded by Magistone and powered by Magistone as its literal and figurative foundation begin to spring up all over Alessian, plunging the entire country into not just civil war, but into a constant state of siege and besieging as warfare. This creates a massive shift politically and culturally in Alessian and its residents. It's clear from this onset that peace cannot be brokered between these two vastly different factions, and war continues to break out until a final shift occurs where the Magistone plunges into the ground, causing a massive explosion and forcing tons of dust and debris up into the air above Alessian. Above that giant cloud, that vortex of stone and dust and silt, the king and the knight's descendants create the Sky Sovereign Nation, a series of massive, almost continent-sized floating platforms, winged knights, and floating structures based on the original version of Alessian culture that they ruled over. But beneath those shifting clouds, the descendants of the merchants and the peasantry create a land-based trade nation that uses Magistone to manipulate the storms to shield themselves from the knights above, and using its magical properties, allow them to defy detection from other nations. Essentially, what the Magistone has done is it has allowed for an immediate shift and jump in technology and power, but it has split its foundational people into two separate nations that both still occupy the original borders of Alessian proper. And it is that world that is plunged into the Magistone's grasp by the time that your players arrive there. And that brings us to the least likely scenario. In all of the things that I have studied, coexistence and synthesis seems to be the one end goal that is most uncommon. The idea that a nation state, kingdom, or group can take a major epoch, a massive cataclysmic change, and make it a part of itself without destroying or terrifyingly shifting the culture in and of itself. That's a rarity, but it exists right now. One of the most interesting cultural syntheses I think is happening. Synthesis is just a funny word, but it's happening right now, is actually going on in modern Mongolia, where the Mongols are actually literally adapting centuries-old practices of migration and horsemanship and adding to it modern technology. They're using things like drones to track eagle migration and environmental patterns. They're installing internet in their yurts. They're using GPS to help them hunt. But in a lot of ways, many of the Mongols, particularly those in lower classes, are actually choosing to readapt themselves to the ways of their ancestors to provide in a time where there is not a lot of economic opportunity, taking advantage of things like cheap imported Western tech. And that's a really interesting thing. It's not something that I have seen before in many different ways, but I did want to bring it up because it's, in my opinion, one of the most interesting new types of synthesis between an ancient tradition and new cultural practices or new technological practices, and yet somehow they're both coexisting. It's absolutely amazing to read a National Geographic article and see a Mongol person in the modern era with an eagle on their arm, and then right behind them see a Mongol person holding a wonderful little GoPro drone. I think it's absolutely astounding, and I would definitely encourage you guys to go look into it. I think it's really, really neat. And how, of course, does that matter? Because eventually this synthesis turns into a slow evolution and then into a completely new culture. Obviously, with the case of the modern Mongol, it's not it's not clear how that culture is going to develop or what's going to happen as a result of it. But what is clear is we can head back to Alessian and figure out exactly what happens as a result of synthesis and coexistence when it comes to Magistone. As with all of the times that we visit Alessian, the Magistone comet crashes through the atmosphere, it lands in Alessian's borders, and this time it happens to every single social strata. The king adapts the Magistone as part of their crown. It uses the power to help funnel things through the palace. The knights immediately start making Magistone armor and Magistone weapons. The merchants build Magistone animals, Magistone transportation, and the peasantry uses Magistone in their farming. Inevitably, it's those advances that get those people to build a society that grows almost exponentially, and as a result, a sort of high tides raise all ships situation begins to unfold in Alessian. As the civilization grows, as its power expands, all of the different social strata start to realize something at the same time. Each one is capable as a social group, as a caste, of making something absolutely amazing. However, the issue is they keep sealing away some of their best innovations behind those social norms. It takes a concerted effort by merchants, knights, the king, and the peasantry to eventually, through shrewd negotiations, actually begin to bring those barriers, those walls down. And over time, Alessian doesn't just destroy its caste system, it adapts it so it becomes less of a social caste and more of almost a type of economic and cultural role that is played. I don't want to say that it winds up in total harmony, but it is a world in which they achieve a kind of equilibrium, and through that equilibrium, a sense of equality. And that comes from the kind of cultural synthesis that the Magistone brings. And with that, my friends, it brings us to the end of our video. I know this one was a little bit more esoteric, but again, we don't have anything quite like lightning bolts coming up against, I don't know, the Ford F-150. So I hoped that through this lens, we can maybe potentially think about how magic and technology would intersect in our games. If you like what we did, and you would like to support us, a huge shout out to all of our members over on Patreon. Again, $10 a month gets you your own unique role-playing game and get early access to some of our content. It's the best way to help support us. But if you want another way too, you can get our physical games over at Tabletop Bookshelf and from our partners over at Indie Press Revolution, and digital copies, our PDFs, can be found over at itch.io. And with that out of the way, I do have to thank my incredible patrons without whom this would not be possible: Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Kavadi, Alex.vksh, Solution, Stefan Verso, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mare, Darth, Arcane Bard, Commander Unidentified, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Carl Agius, David Z, Michael Torres, and Talath, and my incredible YouTube members: Ro.kn, Gaming Gambison, Agile Monk, Joshua Williams, Green, Artemis, Marcus Miller, Samuel Putnam, Lorenzo Buck, Seralder, Chandler Dwyer, Sir Goldschmidt, Jacob, Marcus Miller, Krebo, and Teddy Twit. You are all absolutely amazing, and if you would like to be part of the Desks and Dorks community and you don't want to be a YouTube member or a Patreon member, you can join our Discord and join us in the discussions there for absolutely nothing. And again, thank you all so much for watching. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You have all been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello everybody, it's Editing Kyle here with a goal. I left out all of the different ways that magic and technology might intersect on the battlefield because we have already done 3 videos on how monsters affect society, on how low fantasy wars might take place, and how to destroy a low fantasy wizard. And I felt like we would maybe tread over some similar ground. However, I could already see a bunch of people in the comments saying, hey, why didn't we address this? And what can we do to make you address this in a video? If you can get this to 500 likes before next Saturday, which is the time that this is posted, so 1 week, 7 days, I will happily change the release schedule to make sure that you get a video on how technology and magic might intersect in the battlefield. In any case, that's it. You all have still been absolutely amazing. I'm still Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.